I only married you because you're the boss's daughter, my husband Jack said with a smile as I lay sick in bed, the scarves and gloves I knit for him all discarded as worthless. He outright expressed his disappointment in me, and I felt the need to hit him back with reality, to show him he was far wrong if he thought everything was going his way. Just thinking about his realization made me chuckle. My name is Chelsea Taylor, and I've been married to Jack for 5 years. Although we don't have any children, we've been living happily together. Jack was a workaholic, often away from home, and there were times when I felt lonely. But his dedication to making time for us on his days off made the loneliness bearable. I got to know Jack through my father, who was originally his boss. Jack suggested I become a stay-at-home wife, which was probably a great factor for me. Thankfully, I had time for myself. So while supporting Jack, I got along with neighbors, started sewing, and worked out. I tried various things to fill my void, but what I particularly enjoyed was sewing and knitting. Every winter, I would give Jack scarves and gloves. Even though the first ones were poorly made, I got better every year, to the point where Jack said they were as good as the ones you get from a store. Hearing my husband's kind words, I became more fond of sewing. Someday when we have a child, I want to sew together, I told Jack. He said, maybe I'll join in and learn when the time comes, and gave me a smile. Of course, I never cut corners in supporting my husband, doing housework, and prioritizing spending time together on his days off. Thanks to his high salary, I must have seemed to lead quite a privileged life from an outsider's perspective. I had no complaints about such a life, vaguely thinking that I would continue to live quietly with my kind husband and our future child. However, the first hint of a shadow over this peaceful living crept up about 2 years ago. I was waiting for Jack to come home as usual when I suddenly felt dizzy and fell. My husband, who had just returned from work, took me to the hospital. When I woke up, I found myself in a hospital bed. According to the conversation between Jack and the doctor, my symptoms weren't light and seemed to be something I'd have to deal with for life. Fortunately, it didn't mean an immediate threat to my life, but it could happen again. Under these circumstances, I was recommended to stay in the hospital until my body recovered somewhat fully. Seeing me anxious, Jack said, "Seems like you'll be hospitalized for a while, but it's all right. I'll come to see you whenever I have time off from work. So let's get through this together." With him holding my hand and saying these words, I felt my anxiety lessen. With my supportive husband by my side, I believed everything would be all right, even though I had no grounds for such a belief. Since then, Jack visited me almost daily, as he promised. He held my hand and asked me how I was doing. If I mentioned that my days at the hospital were boring, he would bring me my favorite sewing tools, and we would sew together and chat about trivial things that happened that day. Spending time teaching my clumsy husband how to sew was especially fun, and each time we did it, I was able to forget the boredom. However, such happy times in the hospital only lasted about a year. After handing over the yearly tradition of a hand-knitted scarf, the frequency of my husband's visits lessened. Now, it's good if he shows his face once every few weeks. At first, I thought my husband must be busy with work and continued my sewing, planning to give him the finished product the next time he came. According to the doctor, I was told that I would be discharged by the end of the year, so I thought I would give him some gloves. Then, I put all my feelings into making the gloves to make up for the time we had been apart. However, when my husband finally came to visit me after a long while, he looked at the gloves I handed him and coldly said, "You're still making these. It's frankly a nuisance." What he then handed to me was the scarf I had painstakingly knitted for him and a divorce paper. The scarf I had worked so hard on last year showed no signs of being worn. It was just as pristine as when I had given it to him. "Has it been 2 years since you've been hospitalized? I heard you'd be discharged soon, but I can't keep taking care of you," he said. "We should get a divorce." I turned my gaze to the divorce papers. Upon hearing these words, Jack had already signed the papers. Seeing that, I thought, so it has come to this. To be honest, ever since he stopped visiting, I had considered this possibility multiple times. To brush off that thought, I even tried to convince myself that he was just busy with work. But the Jack I knew would never neglect me, no matter how busy he was. If his work really had gotten busier, he would have told me. I had a feeling things would turn out this way when he stopped showing up without any explanation. That's why I managed to ask him why he wanted a divorce without too much distress. I wasn't trying to cling to Jack. In fact, I knew I had probably become a burden to him. If the kind Jack I knew said he wanted a divorce, then I guess I had no choice. But it was Jack who told me we'd get over this together, so I was somewhat curious as to why he had changed his mind. In response to my somewhat dazed question, Jack said, "Isn't it obvious? Ever since I married you, all I've had are troubles. I'm sick and tired of the scarves and gloves you give me every year. I only married you because you're the boss's daughter. How can I be expected to deal with you getting sick on top of everything else?" He laughed at me in a way that seemed to be making fun of me. He told me that he was tired of dealing with me, who had been innocently enjoying our life together. Every time I talked about happiness, love, or loneliness, it seems he thought I was a fool for it. Who can even wear a handmade scarf without feeling embarrassed nowadays? Receiving such things is a nuisance and annoying. When I looked at Jack's neck as he was talking, I saw a high-end scarf that I didn't remember giving him. Certainly, when compared to the scarf I made, it was of superior quality, and there was no need to compare which was better. I wondered if he had never used any of the items I'd given him till now. He must have been irritated by them all along, and I just wasn't aware. After I was hospitalized, my father retired soon after and was no longer at the company. Hence Jack didn't have to be considerate towards me anymore. And if his wife was ill, it would provide a convenient excuse at work. Furthermore, for the first year, he made a show of visiting me in between his work. I could imagine my father, prior to his retirement, often speaking about this at work, portraying my husband as a good man who works hard while caring for his ill wife. It was obvious that he had established this persona and was well regarded by his colleagues. That was what he wanted, and it seems the value he saw in me was realized when I fell ill. When I voiced these thoughts, my husband looked surprised and confessed, "Well, it did make work easier. When I spoke about you, everyone was sympathetic and treated me nicely. If I worked a little overtime, I was praised for being diligent and responsible. If I wanted to take a break, all I had to say was my wife is, and that was it." He admitted this without any sign of remorse. He had skillfully used my situation to his advantage in ways I wasn't aware of. As for my name's up for the next promotion, I mean, they're all idiots, but I have to thank your illness for that, he continued. As I listened to him with my eyes downcast, I lifted my gaze after he finished talking. What I saw was an ugly grin, and the man I loved was nowhere to be found. I understood that this was his true nature. "Well, if I could be of help, that's good. We probably won't see each other again, so take care," I simply said, and handed back the divorce papers. He had no use for me after receiving them and quickly turned on his heel to leave. Thus our divorce was finalized, and I quietly wept. After some time, I was discharged from the hospital and returned home with my parents. When my father heard about what had happened, he raised his voice. "I never thought he would be that kind of guy," he said, but to me it didn't matter anymore. I calmed my father down and told him that I wanted to move back to my parents' home. Once I finished tidying up the house, my parents were understanding and told me to do what made me happy. For now, I decided to live with my parents. Before that, though, I decided to visit the house. Where I had lived with my husband, however, a problem arose. The front door lock wasn't working. Confused, my parents and I looked at each other and decided to ring the doorbell, only to be greeted by a stranger. In my bewilderment, I asked him about the situation, and he said he had bought the house a little while ago. It seemed he had been living there for a few months already and appeared to be happily living with his wife and child. My parents' anger only grew with this revelation, but I chose not to disturb the new family. I bowed my head and quietly left. However, I couldn't just let things be, so I immediately contacted my husband. He casually responded on the phone, "Ah, yeah, I sold it while you were in the hospital. I'm keeping the sales money as compensation. It was my house to begin with, so you have no complaint, right?" I couldn't help but let out a sigh at his nonchalant words. I wish he could told me sooner. From what I gathered from the new owner, the house had been sold quite a while ago. My husband probably put it up for sale about a year ago, around the time he stopped showing up. Even if he intended to divorce me at that point, selling the house without any discussion was just outrageous. Our divorce had already been finalized with the submission of our signed divorce papers. However, since I was in the hospital, we had agreed to discuss compensation and asset division after my discharge. We had planned a meeting for next week, but my husband had taken action on his own, which was just unbelievable. What was even more troubling was that my husband didn't seem to think he had done anything wrong. That's why I told him calmly over the phone, "You really don't know anything, do you?" "Huh? What do you mean?" he asked, sounding puzzled. To which I responded, "I'll explain in detail next week," and then I hung up. I smiled at my worried parents and told my father I had a favor to ask. I shared my thoughts with him and asked him to prepare for what was to come. I see. I've got it all prepared, the necessary documents. The discussion is next week, so there's not much time. But we'll manage somehow, my father said, offering a slightly troubled smile. As a father, he probably feels some guilt for recommending my husband to me. His anger at my husband seemed to fuel him to do whatever he could. I thanked my father and waited for the day of our discussion. Imagining my husband's face at that time brought a smile to my face for the first time in a while. With my father's help, I prepared for the meeting. The place we chose for our discussion was at my family's home. My parents and I sat in a line, with my husband sitting alone across from us. Surely, he knew that my parents were injured by the divorce, but he didn't seem to care anymore. He probably thought there was no longer a need to be mindful of my parents. His composure was unshaken, even a hint of a smile was visible on his face. His demeanor was nothing short of insolent. I'm the victim here, however, and don't intend to demand too much alimony. The proceeds from the sale of the house will suffice, he said. His words conveyed a sense of magnanimity, as if he was making a compromise. Seeing his attitude, my father's face turned crimson, but I gently placed my hand on his, trying to calm him down. In this discussion, the one who would be at a disadvantage is not us, but my husband. Knowing this, there was no need for us to be unnecessarily upset. There's something important we need to discuss first. As I spoke, my father presented a document. It was a paper proving that the land on which my husband's sold house stood was owned by my father. Indeed, the house was in your name. There's no disputing that. However, the land on which the house stands is my father's property, and he still holds the title to it. That should be clear from this document, right? Upon hearing my words, my husband slightly furrowed his brow. So what? The house was mine regardless. No one has the right to complain. Do you think you can retaliate against me with that? He chuckled and sighed, as if he found the situation ridiculous. It's true that even if the land title was in my father's name, there's no problem with the sale of the house as long as the house is under my husband's name. I continued. My husband must have looked into this matter before selling the house, and indeed, there were no legal issues with his actions. However, this is only from a legal perspective. For the family that bought the house, this would create a significant issue. You sold the house, didn't you? But considering we have the rights to the land, my father can demand rent from the family living there. Won't that cause some trouble? I asked. The situation is different from what they were told. Neither my father nor I intend to take such a course of action. However, that does not mean we are willing to relinquish the rights to our land for nothing. In that case, the action we would take is to sell the land to the family. We wouldn't go so far as to ask them to leave, nor do we plan on charging monthly rent. But naturally, it would be problematic for us if they did not purchase the land. Originally, that land was something my father had gifted us to live on, not to be freely given away to strangers. And if that happens, I hear the family who bought the house could sue you because, as I said earlier, the deal was not as they had been told. Imagine the frustration they find finally buying their dream house only to learn the land is owned by someone else, and they now have more expenses. After obtaining the proof of my father's land ownership, we immediately went to that family. Once we explained the situation, they were understanding. They reasoned that if there's any trouble, it's the seller's responsibility. Therefore, if the negotiations here don't go well, they would end up suing my husband. Seeing my husband's face turn pale, I could tell he understood my point. He seemed to realize that no matter what, he would incur a significant amount of money due to his mistake. In a trembling voice, he asked, "What should I do then?" To this, I smiled and responded, "The family could purchase the land from us and consolidate the ownership. Then you make up for that amount. This would settle everything smoothly. In this scenario, the family won't have to unnecessarily sue my husband. If the family becomes the owners of both the house and land, all the current issues will be resolved. Of course, they weren't informed about the land price when they bought the house, so they will likely charge my husband for it. But that's not their family's problem. The issue would be that because the land is in a prime location, the cost of the land could be higher than the sale price of the house. Even if my husband gives up all his assets, it won't be enough. In the end, he won't have a penny left to his name. Or you could buy back the house, then pay for the land. Of course, you'd have to pay the family a relocation fee. In this case, both the land and house would return to my husband's possession. He could then sell them again, which could give him some money. However, considering the revocation fee, there's a low chance that my husband will end up with any money. Whichever option he chooses, my husband will be at a loss. Also, about alimony, I've been mentally distressed by your actions. I plan to claim compensation for that, so keep that in mind. All this time, my husband Jack used me as a pawn in his pursuit of promotion at work. Now that I know this, I am repulsed by everything Jack did for me in the past, and I plan to file for damages due to emotional distress because of it. Though evidence is scarce and it's not very likely that I will win, just discussing this matter is significant given Jack's current circumstances. Jack, who was cornered, might not have the luxury to consider these possibilities, and everything I've just stated might become his reality. To further quarter Jack, my father continues, even though I'm retired and no longer part of the company, I have many acquaintances. I've been chatting frequently with my former subordinates lately. They've been telling me what you thought of my daughter and what you did. Everyone has been looking down on you, Jack. With a cheerful smile, my father shares this news, and Jack finally realizes the situation he's in. The status he had built in the company using me and the money he gained by selling the house without my consent. Neither of these are in his hands anymore. Now, let's discuss what comes next. Now that you understand your circumstance, we have to decide about the division of property, compensation, and the house. I say, joining my hands together and smiling. My smile hasn't changed compared to the ones I've shown Jack before, and I'm sure I was beaming more than I ever had since our separation. I hope you fully comprehend that the fate of your assets will be decided in this very meeting. I continue. Drawn in by my words, all Jack could do was force a laugh with tears in his eyes. The subsequent negotiations were in my favor, and Jack agreed to pay me alimony. We also agreed that Jack would pay for the land where the house stands, and we later explained this to the family who bought our house. As a result, everyone except Jack benefited from these discussions, and Jack ended up losing everything. The rumors my father initiated began to circulate within the company, causing Jack to lose his standing, and his potential promotion was put on hold due to concerns raised by upper management. The rumors continued to spread, leaving Jack without a place to fit in, and soon my father informed me that Jack had resigned. I won't say that all of it was karma, but things gained through exploitation can vanish easily, given someone's intentions. What Jack thought he had achieved was merely transient. As for me, I'm currently living in my parents' house and running a sewing class. I can't say that my classes are jam-packed, but I've been able to earn a decent income thanks to attendees like my neighborhood wives and kids. While I couldn't make it happen with my own children, like I once told Jack, I've now realized that sharing the things I love with others indeed brings me happiness.